President Alexander Stubb, thank you very much for speaking with us here on Citizen Television.
Thanks for the invitation.
Let's begin with your state visit to the country. Why are you here?
Well, many reasons. First reason is that there's never been a state visit by a Finnish president, which I was quite baffled about because we do have good relations for over 60 years and we've been quite close countries. Secondly, I met your president at a peace conference in Switzerland last summer and I said, can I come and knock on your door? And he invited me. And then probably thirdly, I think, we're witnessing a change of the world order, a similar moment that probably the leaders of 1918, 1945, 1960s, 1989 saw. And I do think that Kenya is going to be one of the swing states in deciding which direction the world is going to tilt, and I want to come here to learn.
Yeah, and it's a new world order.
Oh, yes.
We will talk about that in a moment. How would you characterize the relationship between Finland and Kenya?
It's very solid. I mean, there's sort of strange similarities in the sense that, remember that Finland is a fairly young nation. You know, we've been independent since 1917, and we began as a poor, developing country that had just sort of been able to lift its shackles from under the Russian Empire. And then one thing led to another, and now we've become a fairly successful country globally. And of course, Kenya as well, I mean, since independence in the 1960s has emerged and developed. Demographically, we're a little bit different. I mean, we are 5.6 million people, and you are 56.
We're 10 times
so
that,
it's a little bit,
yeah.
it's a little bit bigger. We've done a lot of cooperation over the years. Usually, it's been on development aid. Now it's much more business. So, a lot of similarities. I think the value base is very similar. And when you think alike about stuff, whether it's media freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, these sort of fundamental tenets of modern liberal democracy and society, then it's quite easy to get along.
Let's talk about your visit with Kenya's President William Ruto. We've heard about educational strategic cooperation. Could you sort of enlighten us a little bit more about the talks you've had with our president?
Yeah, sure. I mean, usually when you get together, you have sort of two formats. One is tete-a-tete, when it's just the two of you and you can talk about everything. And then one is with delegations. And the way in which I sort of deduct this is first you start with bilateral relations, then you move into global affairs, and then you look at regional stuff. So you're able to exchange notes, which is quite useful. So I was probably able to give some pointers to the president about what's going on in Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, because I had phone conversations with President Trump and President Zelensky twice last week. And then the president was able to tell me about the situation in DRC, Congo, Rwanda, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and many other places. So this is very useful. On the bilateral side, I'd say, education was one of the focal points. And I always keep on saying that education is the foundation of civilization anywhere. And the more you focus on it, the better off I think you are. We also talked about peace mediation, where we signed a memorandum of understanding. But as I always say, final point, I think diplomacy is about, on one hand, state-to-state relations, so Finland, Kenya, and the other side is personal relations among presidents, among diplomats, among ministers. The more you know of each other, the more useful the relationship is.
Yeah, let's talk about education, because Finland is known globally for its equitable, its high-performing education system, and Kenya is in the middle of a transition towards a competency-based education system, and trying to see if we can address the disparities in terms of access and outcomes. Mr. President, what sort of principles or policy decisions do you think would be applicable for Kenya if we to sort of take lessons from Finland?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of always a little bit timid to give advice or lessons. I can just say what we did to get things right. So, first of all, pre-independence, for us, it was all about civilization and education and reading and writing and learning. That was part of our identity. That's how we wanted to be different, say, from Russia. Then, once we gained our independence, reading, writing, learning was still very much part of our DNA, whether in school or later on in university. And I think the foundation of a good education system has a few founding pillars. One, of course, is freedom of education. A second one is autonomy. I think it's very important that teachers are allowed to teach autonomously, their subject, whether it be history or chemistry or whatever it might be. Then with all of this comes respect for the teacher. I'm a firm believer in, Aristotle's thesis that there's nothing more noble than teaching the young. And I still think that applies. And that means that in Finland, for instance, in order for you to be a teacher, you need to have a master's degree. So, there are these kinds of elements that we all bring together. Now, an education system is never perfect, but if you begin from the notion of equity and then allow kids who are able to move ahead to go a little bit faster, I think you're doing quite well.
Okay. And when we stay on education, because that is something that is important, Mr. President, I know this came up in your press conference with President William Ruto. Kenyans' search for education led them to Finland for a scandal that is now, about slightly over $7 million US, or 1 billion Kenya shillings. It's parents who do the best they can. Many of them were selling literally all their assets to enable children go to school. I just wonder what your comment is on that, considering education is a key pillar in Finland.
Well, again, I can't comment on an internal matter, which, from what I understand, is being dealt with and
in the courts of law. Yes.
Yeah, which I hope it does. All I can speak for is that I hope that we still continue to have a flow of young Kenyan students coming over to Finland. Your average age is 19. You have a very strong youth movement. So anytime you have this sort of link to a country through education, it's very useful. I can only speak on my own example. I did my high school in Finland. I matriculated from there, but then I was able to go and study to the United States, and that's where I had my academic awakening. So for me, it was sort of an identity issue. I started to study. I started to love learning, and it became a part of who I am. So if I see young Kenyan students going to Finland and getting a 3, 4, 5, even 6-year experience, I think that would be fantastic, and I hope whichever issues are being dealt with can be sorted out.
All right. Let's speak about the state of democracy in Kenya, perhaps around the world, but let's start with Kenya. President Stubb, almost a year ago, young Kenyans were out on the streets and they were clamoring for good governance, against high taxation, the cost of living, and the fight against corruption. Is this perhaps something that came up in conversation with the president, and what were your thoughts? July 2024 was a monumental time for Kenya in its quest towards democracy, and that made headlines around the world. What are your thoughts about the state of democracy at the moment?
Well, probably two things. First, I think June 25th became a symbol in many ways, and mainly because of the youth movement. I had the opportunity to speak to a number of NGOs, including leaders from that youth movement. So I got a pretty good picture of how they saw things. I also discussed this matter with President Ruto, and I got a picture of how he saw this thing. And again, if I may sort of commend Kenya for trying to solve issues that were related around 25th of June. Now, my second point is about democracy in general. We have to understand that liberal democracy is not an end state. It is something that you have to work at and nurture at all times. It has a few basic tenets. Elections, judiciary, separation between executive, legislative, and judiciary, rule of law, strong institutions, freedom of speech, free media, and free civil society. I think liberal democracy hasn't adapted to modern technology. So it was created, in the 1700s when everything was supposed to be very slow and cumbersome, and now we live in a technological world where direct democracy is much easier. And every country is going through different phases of how to grapple with it. Your demographic curve is probably different from the older demographic curve in Finland. So I welcome the type of youth activism, democracy that I see in Kenya, albeit I look at it from afar. But look, there are right now liberal democracies around the world, in Europe, in North America, which are putting limits to the basic freedoms, what democracy is all about. And we have to be very careful with those things. We have to make sure they don't happen. And that's why I think rule of law is the basis of everything.
Right. There's a section of young Kenyans who would feel that what you've described as happening in other parts of the world may be something that's happening here. Some who are dissatisfied with the level of investigations that are going in and are seeing a return to clamping down on those rights and freedoms. In fact, Mr. President, sometimes young Kenyans don't take too kindly to visiting dignitaries and presidents because they sometimes see that as an endorsement of a regime that they sometimes feel doesn't quite listen to them. What would be your message to them?
Yeah, no, the first message is that diplomacy is different from general governance, right? So you have diplomacy on two levels. One is state to state, and the other one is person to person. What I try to detach in my diplomacy is ideology. So there might be things that I disagree with, say, for instance, in the United States right now. There might be things that I, disagree with in any democracy. It could be a right-left issue. It could be an institutional issue. But that should not stop me from having a conversation with someone else. Now, Finland has defined their foreign policy as values-based realism. Now, values-based realism is related to this question because it means, on one hand, that you stick to your values, freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, fundamental rights, right of assembly, etc. But the realist in you says that you can't solve all of the world's problems, climate change, demography, technology, economy, or development, just with the people who you agree with. So, as I always say as a Finn, not everyone can be Sweden.
That's a good one. Can we talk then about what's happening in the world in general? I'd like to begin with calls for reform of the United Nations. Our own President William Ruto, and I believe you might have had this conversation when you met him last year in September, our own president is calling for reform of the UN, saying that in the manner in which it is structured now, it is ineffective towards tackling issues such as climate change, conflict, inequalities. Is this a view you share?
We're on the same page on this. Mm-hmm. So, I just finished a book which I had been writing for 4 years. It's called The Triangle of Power, Rebalancing the New World Order. Yeah. Don't worry, this is not a commercial, it's coming out next year. Now, my big thesis is that you have the global West, which is sort of trying to protect the current world order. The UN, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. Why? Because they created it post-World War II. Then you have the global East, led by China, followed by Russia and others, who basically try to change it because they feel that it's too much skewed to the West. My argument in the book, that it's going to be the global South that actually decides the next world order, just like they were deciders after World War I, after World War II, and after the Cold War. And what began this transition was, of course, the realization that demography is changing. This is the African continent is going to have 4 billion inhabitants by the end of this century, but also general development. And in that system, you have a few key states: India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and a few others who are going to tilt this world in one way or another. Now, how do we then do this? If we want to preserve the multilateral world, so the UN, you have to give agency to the countries that don't feel like they have agency. So why do you have a Security Council which is based on the winners of World War II and veto power? I mean, that's why I myself suggested in a speech in the UN in September that the composition of the Security Council should be doubled from 5 to 10. And we should have at least 1 from Latin America, 2 from Africa, and 2 from Asia. And then Europeans can sort themselves out, because essentially we have 3 places, right? The UK, France, and Russia. So why? I say this because if we want the UN to be the center of peace as an institution, then everyone has to have a say.
Right, and part of the reforms is also of the global financial architecture,
yes.
right, which is the way it's lending. And there's people who say, look, Africa doesn't have a debt problem. Africa has a cost of debt problem, where even 25 African states are paying more towards their debt than they are enabled to invest in, say, healthcare, for instance. Where do you see that? Because some of those multilateral organizations are those that you mentioned that were formed after the World War, Second World War, and were for a completely different reality and time. Should there be a reform of the global financial architecture? And what role would a country like Finland play in that towards enabling countries of the global south, like Kenya, be on the table and able to access cheaper credit? Because they're saying, we're fine, we want to borrow, but the rates...
Too high, yeah. I mean, a few observations on that. Finland, of course, is, part of a bigger group inside the IMF. And I would consider us to be reformist. Our stake is very small, and we fully understand the discrepancies in the system. So again, a shift in the power balance should take place there. As a little side note and a parenthesis, when I quit politics in 2016, before I came back, I was actually in the board of the One campaign, driven by Bono, which was, of course, a lot about debt relief and other things. And in the meanwhile, I was in the European Investment Bank, which is the biggest public bank in the world. It's actually bigger than the World Bank and bigger than the EBRD. And my approach was always to say that the financial system in the world is a little bit like the bloodstream of a human being, that if it's not flowing, you're not going to get economic growth out of it. So I do think there needs to be a rebalancing. Having said all of that, the one thing I'm a little bit worried about is that, of course, China has become the biggest creditor to a huge amount of countries in this world. So I can't give you an exact figure, but
including
there is
Kenya,
a majority of African states that have more credit from China than, say, the IMF or the other global banks. So we need to work on this together. But there is a discrepancy and injustice there we need to fix.
Okay, the New World Order. Let's talk about that. These are interesting times, Mr. President. There's lots of uncertainty, trade tensions. We know a little bit of that is easing now with the US and China having gotten an agreement to US and the UK. But what are your thoughts around how states, nations, even members of private sector would deal with a time of such uncertainty as we're living in now?
Okay, so if you're a company, you better have a chief geostrategic officer, because a lot of economy now is about, geopolitics. But I think the big picture to see here is that there are times in history when the world order changes. 1918, 1945, 1989, examples. And when the world order changes, there's always going to be disorder before it happens. And we are right now in that period of disorder. And I think it will take somewhere between 5 to 10 years. Of course, I would like to see us revert sort of back to multilateralism and international institutions, norms and rules, but that means that we have to change the power balance because countries like Kenya don't get their voices enough heard. And I say this behind your back as well, not only on TV. Don't worry about it.
All right.
And right now we're also in an interesting sort of change that we're going back to big power, not conflict necessarily, but tension. And that means that we might be going back to some kind of a concert of powers as we had in the 1800s. When you have big players such as the United States, Russia, China, sort of perhaps wanting to split up or divide the world a little bit. And that means that, us who are smaller players, not Kenya, but Finland, we want to go back and try to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I think the choice essentially is between multipolar disorder, so everyone for themselves, dog eats dog, and multilateral cooperation. And I want this multilateral cooperation to take place because that's when the world, in my mind at least, is more just, even for a small guy.
Where do you think Kenya stands or lies or, ways in which you can navigate these waters? For instance, there is the thinking that many countries in Europe, perhaps Finland as well, are moving more into defense budgets with everything that's happening with Europe's security and NATO. President Trump is saying, I'm not going to continue to commit as many or as much resources as I have to NATO, and that you're now moving, from focusing more on your defense budgets. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And that you might divert some of the money that is for development in terms of agreements and cooperation between Finland and Kenya. Should Kenyans be worried about where the relationship, for instance, with Finland will go if, your priorities are shifting in Europe?
No, but let me give you two answers. One is on defense. I think we're moving back towards a world where we're increasing our defense expenditure to the levels that they were actually during the Cold War. We forget that during the Cold War, we were north of 5%, regardless of development aid, right? And then when history ended and we ended up living in La La Land post-1989 with green fields and peace signs and rainbows and everyone living happily ever after, people brought down their defense expenditure. Finland didn't that much because we live next to Russia. We have 1,340 kilometers of border with essentially an imperialist colonial power that has a tendency to go for power grabs as they did in Georgia and now in Ukraine. So we kept up a military. But now the pressure is back. And I think this was sort of one of these wake up and smell the coffee moments for Europe. So in Europe, the thinking was we were probably too dependent on Russian energy, too dependent on American security, and too dependent on the Chinese economy. And now, we're coming back to roost a little bit. Now, I always see an opportunity in this, and this is my second answer. So don't focus too much on development aid. Focus on working with the Europeans in a manner of equal trading partners. And this is what Europe needs to understand as well, because I think Europe has tried to have the moral high ground and, very difficult to get free trade agreements because of agriculture and other things. And now we need to understand that, okay, if the rules are a little bit limited, what Europe is now doing is forging these types of bilateral trade relations. So EU, and Kenya, or something like that. So let's work on that instead. I think back home, actually, the mentality is a little bit more, oh my God, we're putting that much on defense. Isn't that away from healthcare and education? Isn't it a zero sum? I think a lot of the defense expenditure is actually going to come from creative financial instruments.
All right. Final question, Mr. President. Kenya and Finland, just where do you see that going in what is, like you said, the period of uncertainty now, but is that why you're here? Do you now see Kenya as an important player? Because you mentioned that at the beginning in this new world order, whatever we will call it by the time we get on to the other side. So talk to us about that and why you see Kenya playing an important role and what role that would be.
Sure, okay. One, both of these things are comfortable for me, but one is based on values. I see Kenya as a thriving democracy, with hits and bumps. We all have them throughout our process, right? So I see essentially, I look at the way in which, say, Kenya reacted in the beginning of Russia's war of aggression. I look at your democratic institutions, just like in Finland, with their imperfections. But there is this sentiment of, democracy, self-correcting mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. So easy to do. Second one is it's pure interest in the sense that I look at Kenya and I say, okay, Kenya is going to be one of the basic tipping point countries in the world. It's going to be among the 10 that decide the new world order. And I kind of want to have a good relationship with a country like that. So these are probably the two essential relations. And I had never been to Kenya. So this is my first visit, and I really wanted to see and hear what the country is like, and that's why the program is so tight for 3 days.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate your time here. And I hope you enjoy Kenya, and hopefully this won't be the last.
No, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so that's the President of Finland, President Alexander Stubb, who's here on a state visit in the country, speaking to us about a host of issues: democracy, the New World Order, the state of the world economy. Thank you, sir.